Hi, welcome. Let's talk about incentivizing good community citizenship with contributor leaderboards. My name is Georg, and I want to walk through with you what are leaderboards, and then to rank people, we need metrics, and then best practices around how to do this in our open source communities. So let's start with leaderboards. We have leaderboards in many places. What are leaderboards? The definition by Merriam-Webster is it's a large board for displaying the ranking of the leaders in a competitive event, such as a golf tournament. We've seen leaderboards be used in other contexts as well. For example, we see the World Happiness Report ranking the countries based on their happiness level. Or companies are ranked based on their size, their revenue, and how much, or how big those companies are in the Fortune 500. Or we can have ranking of like mobile games, or in sales teams, we can have people being ranked by how well they are performing. Or in open source, we also have rankings like GitHub or stars. Git stars is an example. Or if you look on GitHub itself at an open source project, we see a leaderboard of who contributed the most commits. Now this can be useful to understand, hey, who are the most impactful, the most active, the most influential people in an open source project. We also have other kinds of leaderboards. For example, the Drupal community has a marketplace where, based on the employees of different companies, what they are doing in the community, like opening issues, responding to them, making commits, adding new features, then they declare I'm doing this for my company, and then those companies are ranked in the marketplace and get visibility, and that helps them with their revenue. Now, those are some examples of leaderboards. Now that we know what we are talking about with regards to leaderboards, let's go into the theory to understand how leaderboards actually work and what they do for people. So leaderboards give instant feedback for contributors. The ranking creates a sense of community. You see where others are. You see where you stand in relation to everyone else. It can be a friendly way of, hey, I'm going to do a little bit more, and then my contributions are being recognized. I'm being rewarded for my activity. And so we want to incentivize a little bit more activity by doing that. Why does this work? Well, there's a self-determination theory where we as humans want to have competence. We want to show and see that what we're doing, we can do well. And we want to have autonomy. I want to have control over my ranking. And by choosing my actions, I can improve my ranking. And then social relatedness means I am looking at what are others doing. And so comparing myself. This is also the social comparison theory, where studies have found if you find yourself in a library studying with others studying, you're more focused on studying. If you find yourself in a sales team and everyone is doing sales and you see how others are performing, you tend to perform better because you're trying to keep up or exceed what others are doing. It also works, leaderboards also works because you can set yourself goals and you want to rank high. And so working towards that goal achieves greater outcomes. There are some issues though with leaderboards. It's not all good. When the ability of people is different, then it's very easy for someone to just give up. I'm never gonna get up there. Others are always gonna be better. So why even bother? I'm always ranked at the bottom. I'll just give up. And highly skilled people also could be disincentivized because they see, oh, I'm always up there. Why should I do any more? I'm already ranked high. Now, it was super easy. There wasn't really any skin in the game. So we want to be mindful of these things. Another thing to be mindful of is how the ranking is actually determined, the score. So to have a better or worse or below and higher ranking, we need to have a score. Now, what happens when we rank, let's say, a sandwich by its thickness? Does that tell us anything about the quality of a sandwich? Probably not. We could have the most disgusting ingredients on the sandwich, but make it really thick and thus rank high, but no one would want to eat it. And we have to be mindful about what we measure and how that relates to our goal. In the case of a sandwich, we probably want deliciousness as a goal. So we need to find a ranking for that. Or we want nutrition, and we can use number of calories or macronutrients or whatever we are interested in. The same is true for our open source communities. We need to be mindful not to measure what is easy to measure for the sake of having some count and biasing our focus towards what is easy to measure. But we need to take a step back and think about, okay, what are the metrics? What are the things, the activities we actually care about? So let's talk about metrics. Let's figure this out. Metrics are a method of measuring something or the results obtained from this measuring. And in open source, we have project data, we have trace data, we have a method for collecting that data, and then we produce that metric. So this is the framework within we discussed in the next couple slides. So project data is usually trace data. There are other data. We can use surveys, we can do interviews, we can do qualitative measurements. But most of the time when we talk about automated ways of producing metrics, we are talking about trace data. Trace data is the data that is kind of accidentally created in the Git log, in the mailing list archive, in any archive, because it's the traces of what we did as a community. Now, none of us are engaging in an open source community with the intent of creating these footsteps, but they happen. And so we can use those, and we have the information about the contributions and the metadata. So who is actually doing this? So that's a little caveat. There is personal identifiable information, PII, like names and emails in the data, which we need to be mindful of for privacy and legal reasons. Now, where do we find this data? Well, I already named some examples: Git, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, Georg, Gerrit, Confluent, where the development is happening, but also where the conversations are happening, the documentation is written, where the community gets together around wikis, discourse, mailing lists, IRC, Slack, meetup.com, Stack Overflow. So take a moment when you want to implement metrics for your open source community, and if you want to build a leaderboard, to think about where is the community, what kinds of activities do I want to recognize, because that's the data we need to collect. Now, once we know what we want to collect, we need to go through a process. We have the raw data that we get from the data sources. We need to work on it, enrich it, unify it, and then we get useful data. And we can talk about what that looks like. So let's go through these different steps. Raw data. This is the probably easiest step. There are APIs we can call, there are logs we can parse. The challenge we have with getting the raw data is that APIs change, the logs that are being provided can change in format, and the data comes, when we collect it from many different sources, comes in different shapes and sizes and forms. So we need to enrich it. We need to unify the data, like date formats, whether it's month, day, year, or day, year, month, with periods or with slashes or with hyphens. Just the date field has so many varieties in which date is encoded. And then there are other things like how messages are encoded, how the usernames are encoded. So we want to unify that data, make it useful, and put it into a format where across all the data sources we can now query the data. One thing we want to also unify on or manage is identities. So who is in the community, who is contributing now and in the past. We want to manage their usernames and email addresses, and maybe we can even see that, hey, this user is using a work email and a private email. Now, whether to combine those and say this is the same person, maybe we want to do that to identify that, recognize that person, but maybe this person also wants to be separate. Then we shouldn't do that. So we need to kind of know our community to do this. When I contribute to open source communities, I have my personal Gmail, I have my work email, I use different usernames across different platforms, and I personally do like to be recognized for all of that work. So we need to manage identities in the data. And then there are some metrics that we need to calculate. The raw data might have when an issue was opened and when an issue was closed, but we might be interested in how long was an issue open. And so we need to subtract one date from the other and calculate that. And if we pre-calculate it, we can do analytics faster, which is how data analytics works. For leaderboards, maybe we want to do other kinds of calculations where we have boxed windows of time, and we want to only look at like 3 months of data. And so being able to decide this is what we want to calculate in the data is important. Now, once we have all the data, we've collected from the data source, we have the raw data, we've enriched it, we've made it useful, but useful to whom? Different users have different expectations or different needs from the data. So we need to think about that and then figure out how they want the data presented. Do they need graphs? Do they need charts? Do they need tables? Do they need the raw data, put it in a pivot table and look at the data themselves, or combine it with other data that they have? So how should it be presented and visualized so that it's meaningful? And then most of the time, it's not just about the data, it's about what we want to do with the data and the story we want to tell around it. So this is a general question here for the purpose of our conversation. We want to build a leaderboard. So that is our story of saying, hey, who is more active or less active so that we can rank them, if that's what our leaderboard is about. Maybe we want to go by sentiment analysis and we have some algorithm that goes through the messages that our contributors are writing and rank them by positivity. There are many different ways we can do this. Now, there are some open source solutions available for collecting the data. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can build on the foundation that open source communities have already built. Cauldron, Chaos has Grimoire Lab and Augur, Apache has Kibble, CNCF has Depth Analytics. And so there are many solutions already out there. When you start with metrics, feel free to build on this foundation. Now, there are some best practices we can already talk about. The Chaos community has come up with several. Who is the Chaos community? What is the Chaos community? Well, you're here at the OpenJS World, which is hosted by the Linux Foundation, and Chaos is another Linux Foundation project, which is short for Community Health Analytics, open source software. We started back 5 years ago to bring together everyone who is interested in community health and working on what are the metrics we can use, what is the health of a community, how do we understand this through metrics. So this is what we are doing, creating analytics and metrics to help define community health. Now, through this work, some best practices is to follow the goal question metric approach, which means don't start with the data and what's easy to measure, but figure out what is it that we want to improve. What do we want to know about our open source community? That's the goal. You know, if we want to build the dashboard, a leaderboard that ranks people by how many issues they opened, then that is the goal. Question, how many issues did someone open? Okay, now we can figure out the metric, which is go to the data collected from GitHub or GitLab, and there we go. Use the metrics to tell a story. The metrics themselves are meaningless. Just because we have a graph that goes up in one direction is good, but it doesn't tell us anything without the story of the community. Maybe it went up because Google Summer of Code. We had a lot of students come in, opening questions, asking because they were hoping to get a scholarship or the Google Summer of Code stipend. We need to tell the story of the community behind the data. And we also want to think about the usefulness of the metric strategy. Are we able to achieve our goals? And maybe we need to tweak our metric strategy. And a concern is also gaming of metrics. Once we put a metric out there and people start looking at it, they change their behavior towards it. And so we need to be careful with that, especially when we do leaderboards, because that is it creates that competition and people are more likely to try to game that. But don't worry about all of this at once. It's better to start small, get off zero, and get started with metrics than to delay indefinitely and have a paralysis. Anyway, it's better to get started small and get off zero. Now, today's talk is about leaderboards. So what do we do about leaderboards to have effective leaderboards in open source communities that incentivize good community citizenship? One thing is to be transparent about the scoring algorithm. Let people know what activities actually go in. There's nothing more frustrating than seeing a leaderboard that you don't know how you got there or why someone else is ahead of you. And so you want to give people the tool to actually improve their scoring. And by saying, hey, this leaderboard is based on issues opened, commits made, on mailing list post, you can help people understand where that ranking comes from so that they can also then do these desired activities. Over time, you want to revise the scoring algorithm and get community feedback on that, maybe have an open call. You don't have to necessarily reveal the exact algorithm, how many points each activity is worth. That might be a small group of people who actually maintain that, because otherwise people will only do what is most impactful. And then over time, you might tweak it and say, okay, we have seen a lot of activity in this part of the community. Now we want more activity over here, and highlight people who are doing something else. So update that regularly. Also, continuously update the leaderboard or automate the data collection. use those open source tools I mentioned earlier, having a stale or outdated leaderboard is not really useful. You want it to provide that immediate feedback or small delay feedback so that as people are climbing the ladder, they can see that it's working. Rather than having one leaderboard for the entire community, it might also make sense to have many leaderboards. If you think about it, comparing the activities of your translation community versus your user experience community versus the issue triaging team is rather challenging. So why not have a leaderboard for translation, one for bug triaging, and one for user experience? And now everyone within their domain of expertise has more comparable activities to others on that leaderboard, and you can incentivize activities in each area. And people can relate more easily to what everyone else on that leaderboard is doing. And so this is how we recognize diverse types of contributions. And at least in my opinion, it's easier to have leaderboards specific to the different areas than to try to find the perfect weighting of how each of those activities relates to others to create one central score. Another thing to do is contextualize leaderboards by showing immediate neighbors. So if you have others that are very similar active, it's easier to try to compete with them, especially if you are seeing them in the same issues, in the same forums, then you start to get that community going. And sometimes it's good to reset leaderboards and ignore older contributions. You know, the founder of a project, yes, has over time made a lot of contributions, but maybe they've become inactive. They're still at the top if we don't purge the leaderboard at some point. And let's create space for new community members to also rise in the ranks. So we can have something like leaderboards are only considering the last 3 months or the last year, or we reset regularly. There are some ideas, some thoughts here. Every community is different, so just do some experiments, figure out what works for your community. Let's recap. We've talked about leaderboards, metrics, and best practices. I am Georg Link, and here's my contact information. I would be happy to chat with you. Feel free to reach out, send me an email, or connect with me on LinkedIn or GitHub or Twitter. And then I used several references. Here are the links for them, and I wish you a good rest of your OpenJS world. Thank you. Bye-bye.